Okay.
Hi, David.
Hello.
Hi, how you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Doing excellently. It's a
Good.
beautiful day here in Washington, D.C., and you are where are you today, David?
I'm in Cambridge in England in the UK, and it's an autumnal evening here. It's dark outside.
Yeah. You're a good 5 hours ahead of me. So, well, thanks for joining us on a Saturday night. It's it wasn't a top of your list. Things to do on Saturday evening.
No, but it's good.
But hopefully we'll have fun. We should introduce ourselves. I'm Wilkinson of the Cato Institute. You are David Runciman. And David, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you work and what you work on.
Yeah, so I teach at Cambridge University. I'm in the politics department there. And I teach the history of ideas, the history of political thought. But I'm also interested in contemporary politics, and I'm really interested in how ideas relate to contemporary politics, looking at the big sweep of ideas and trying to draw connections between the previous centuries and the 21st.
Excellent. Well, and the reason we are having this discussion is because you recently published a new book called Political Hypocrisy. I'm holding it up to the camera now so people can see it. The
great.
Mask of Power from Hobbes to Orwell and Beyond. I like the cover. I like the picture of the guy with his fingers crossed behind his back.
Yeah, I think it captures what the book's about.
It does pretty much capture what the book's about. So let's talk a little bit about hypocrisy generally, and then political hypocrisy, and then sort of move on to more the meat of your book. So I think we all know what hypocrisy is, but give me your best account of what you take hypocrisy to be.
Okay, well, I think we know what it is because it's come to mean something in particular, which is people who don't practice what they preach. So usually I think when people talk about hypocrisy now, what they mean is someone who says something in public and then reserves some part of their private lives or private selves which doesn't match up to that standard. But what I try and show in the book is that there's a broader account of what hypocrisy is, and it originally meant just to wear a mask. And so there are lots of different things that you can mask, and masking your private behavior is one thing, but masking your private beliefs is another thing. And traditionally that's what it meant. It meant people who said something which wasn't in their hearts, or they didn't believe at the core of their being. And one of the things I try and do in the book is look a little bit at how the idea has shifted, and in a more democratic age, we're more obsessed with people's private lives and not their beliefs.
Yeah. So because these days, when somebody thinks of hypocrisy of a politician, it'll be like, I condemn someone for having had an extramarital affair, yet I've had one myself. Right? That would be so hypocritical.
It's the Elliot Spitzer definition of hypocrisy.
Yeah. But we don't think of it as
people.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's what it's come to mean, and certainly in political journalism, it's shorthand specifically for that, I think.
Yeah, but we don't think of it as so when Barack Obama makes a bunch of protectionist noises about reevaluating NAFTA, and then one of his political advisors says, look, he doesn't really mean that. We don't actually. That's not what we are thinking of when we think of hypocrisy. Exactly. Even though that's what classically it might have been.
Yeah, I mean, classical writers and early modern writers would have thought of that as hypocrisy, and we don't use the word, but I think we recognize a kind of family resemblance, and some of the anxiety, for example, about flip-flopping is very close to our anxiety about hypocrisy. The specific heart of our obsession, our current obsession with hypocrisy, is this sense of people preserving some little private part of their lives which they think have standards that apply to just them, whereas they're laying down the law for everyone else. But that broader definition of masking some aspect of yourself, that's really what I try and track in the book.
Yeah, so in that view of hypocrisy, then the opposite of hypocrisy would be a certain kind of sincerity or a certain kind of openness.
Yeah, sincerity or openness, or in some cases a kind of authenticity. Someone who is kind of true to themselves all the way through, if you see what I mean, that as where what's on the outside and what's on the inside match up. But again, in contemporary politics, I think the opposite is more likely to be a kind of sincerity. When they speak, you think that the politician is speaking from the heart.
So why is it then that hypocrisy is thought to be a special danger in liberal democratic societies? What is it that makes it seem like such a vice, and why is it such a powerful charge when somebody is charged with being a hypocrite? Why is this such a big deal?
I think there are two sides to it, and I think it's important to separate them out. One side of it is the basic emotional response that people have to being treated like fools. And the thing about hypocrites, particularly in the contemporary definition of it, is that they're pulling the wool over our eyes. They're pretending in a way that makes us feel like they think we're idiots. And that's, I think, a large part of why it has such a charge in politics. But then the other side of it is that there are underlying values and principles, I think, in liberal democratic politics that hypocrisy seems to cut against. And these are the values of openness, a certain kind of sincerity, truth-telling, and then in democratic societies, a feeling that things aren't being kept from the people. And it's when these two things come together that it's such a toxic charge.
Yeah, but it seems like a particular, more of a personal vice, hypocrisy. So so it seems like some of the chief values of a liberal democracy are things like transparency, the principle of publicity, say that you should be able to publicly state what the real rules are, right? That people ought to be able to know the laws that govern them, and the principles that are sort of guiding people's lives, the system of laws, ought not to be something that's sort of hidden. But that pertains to sort of institutions more than to people. When I think of the liberal values of transparency and publicity, I think of something that has something to do with institutions. Whereas hypocrisy seems to have to do with the people who are running for office. They're the hypocrites.
There are ways of thinking about hypocrisy as a kind of institutional vice, but it is almost always used as a personal vice. And I think it's the institutional form of it is the idea that the rules apply to everyone, and therefore a hypocrite is someone who is preserving some little part of the rules which don't apply to them themselves. But it's the combination of that idea with the sort of public exposure that we expect of politicians in a democratic age, of candidates, the level of scrutiny that we expect them to subject themselves to. And it's looking for the things that they're trying to hide in that context. And hypocrisy is something that comes up not just broadly in democratic politics, but particularly in electoral politics. It's a preoccupation of electoral cycles, and it's also something that is fueled by the prevalence of information that you get in liberal democratic societies, the fact that the past of politicians is out there, the information is out there, and the internet has made this even more of a problem, that politicians say things and do things in private or when they think the cameras aren't rolling that crop up. And when they crop up, it's that juxtaposition of some individual saying something and then acting in a way that goes against that just captures it in a way that the institutional version of it doesn't.
Now, you argue that hypocrisy is unavoidable in electoral democratic politics, but not all forms of hypocrisy are the same. And so the question is, what kind of hypocrites do we want our politicians to be? So can you say something about what some of these kinds of hypocrisy might be, so that and then we can talk a little bit later about what kinds of hypocrites various politicians are after we get through some of the history.
Sure. I mean, just to say something about what you said at the beginning there, part of the point of this book is that hypocrite has become this general term of abuse, and it's a catch-all term. It's assumed that it's a kind of deal breaker. If the politician is a hypocrite, you've exposed them as a kind of fraud. And there is a preoccupation with hypocrisy in democratic politics and in the media, that hunt the hypocrite kind of syndrome that we have, I think, in politics. And in this book, I'm trying to argue that there's something profoundly self-defeating about that an obsession with hypocrisy and a sense that it's always a bad thing doesn't give you less hypocrisy, it gives you more hypocrisy. It gives you politicians who are more careful, cautious, with more to hide, and it gives you more fake sincerity. And I'm trying to say in this book that we need to get away from a kind of choice that I think is an increasingly prevalent one between the sanctimony of anti-hypocrisy and the cynicism of saying, well, okay, if hypocrisy is not a bad thing, then we just got to accept they're hypocrites and that's all we can do. And I want to argue in this book that if you look at the history of ideas, the really interesting writers have said it's not a bad thing or a good thing, it's something that plays out differently. And so I'm trying to suggest that it's this false choice, I think, between sanctimony and cynicism that the writers that I look at in this book get away from by saying, with hypocrisy, the question is not, is that politician a hypocrite? It's what kind. And if you ask that question, you get more interesting answers.
Excellent. Well, one of the main thinkers that you cover in the book is Thomas Hobbes, and you provocatively say that people who are interested in electoral politics and sort of like hardball, real politics, often they think their sort of go-to thinkers are, Machiavelli and the Prince, or Sun Tzu's Art of War.
Yeah.
Because these are the guys who are really going to give you the sort of like art of sort of dissimulation and strategic backstabbing.
Yeah.
But you argue that we can learn a lot more about hypocrisy and its political uses from somebody like Hobbes. So tell us what Hobbes thought about hypocrisy, because he's got a subtle view relative to some others.
Sure, yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, Hobbes is often run together with Machiavelli just as one of the practitioners or one of the champions of a kind of dark arts view of politics. And yet I argue in the book that the big difference between Hobbes and Machiavelli is Hobbes is describing a politics which is recognizably our politics. That is, it's representative. It's not democratic as we would understand it, but it's all about the role of the representative politician. Machiavelli is not describing that. He's describing a politics which is as distant from ours as you can get. So I think Hobbes is more interesting for that reason, but then he's also more interesting because the writers that I'm interested in are the ones who are torn about hypocrisy. I don't think Machiavelli is torn about hypocrisy. I think he just thinks it's another of the tricks of the prince. But Hobbes is torn about hypocrisy, and the sign that he's torn about hypocrisy is that on the one hand, he uses the term as a term of abuse. If he calls you a hypocrite, it means he thinks you're bad. But on the other hand, the politics that he describes is one that his contemporaries would recognize, and I think we would recognize, as containing a lot of hypocrisy. And he doesn't just say that's okay, he says it's essential. So if he's saying hypocrisy is a bad thing, and yet many of the things that we call hypocrisy are essential to our politics, I argue he must be one of those writers who separates out different kinds of hypocrisy, and I think he does. And I think he says that one kind is unavoidable and another kind is absolutely toxic.
Mm-hmm. So which are they? What's the toxic hypocrisy, and what's the unavoidable and therefore somewhat benign kind?
Yeah. So to start with the unavoidable kind of hypocrisy is the hypocrisy of people whose public statements, professions of belief, particularly of faith, particularly of religious faith, simply don't capture what they believe inside. Mm-hmm. And this was completely, the reason that this shocked people at least as much as Machiavelli is it was absolutely an explicit statement that the kind of hypocrisy that's okay is religious hypocrisy. And obviously in the 17th century, that in a political context, that was an outrageous thing to say. But Hobbes is completely clear that in any political society that's going to stand a chance of surviving the pressures politics puts on both citizens and politicians, people have got to dissemble about their convictions. Mm-hmm. So that kind of hypocrisy is okay. And when Hobbes was writing, that's what people would have meant by hypocrisy. So he's doing a very subversive act here. He's taking the word and saying, the thing you call hypocrisy is fine. The thing he calls hypocrisy that's not fine is hypocrisy about power. That is, people who don't tell the truth about the basic foundations of political life, who try and cover up some of these big institutional or structural features of stable politics. And I think I try and argue in the book that there's at least a version of that argument that can run all the way through modern politics. And that one of the themes I want to raise is how I think we've got it the wrong way round, and that we're preoccupied with what you might call personal hypocrisy, questions of personal sincerity, conviction and authenticity, including in questions of faith. And we're less concerned with what Hobbes would say is the real question, which is not, is the politician telling us the truth about themselves, but are they telling us the truth about politics and power and all the compromises that it entails?
So tell me a little bit more about what Hobbes thinks it would require to not be a hypocrite about the actual, institutions of power. What it would mean to because it this is something that I struggle with in the sense that once a government gets of a certain kind of complexity, it's very, very difficult to actually explain truthfully to people exactly how it works. That in a democratic system, and once government gets to be a certain size, when you live in Washington D.C. for a number of years, people they'll say living inside the sausage grinder, right? You see the sort of like disgusting process by which everything is actually generated. To actually be accurate, to not dissemble about politics, if you do that, people will accuse you of being irredeemably cynical, and that they'll actually accuse you of being
a hypocrite.
Yeah, well, they'll accuse you of being anti-democratic, or just contrary to the idea of government, simply because you've given a realistic account of the way government works, the way all this log rolling goes on, the way all the special interests rent seek, the way that they it's just a mundane day-to-day business here in Washington D.C. That's the chief of staff for a senator has lunch with a lobbyist. They basically make a deal. This senator is going to vote for this, is going to support this other senator's bill in exchange for some other senator's support on something else. And that stuff is all completely off the radar. Nobody knows. But even if you describe that, people will say, you're cynical and trying to undermine our faith in government. So it seems like people, there's a general demand for a kind of hypocrisy in the sense of masking the true nature of the political process.
I understand exactly what you're saying. I think the way I would try and answer that in my terms or in Hobbes's terms, if they're the same, is that Hobbes is not calling for, the words you used were full disclosure, truthfulness, accuracy. Hobbes, of all people, wasn't someone, I think, who thought that in politics to rule a state was simply to expose everything that you do to anyone who's interested.
Right.
But I think what he's saying, it's not, as it were, he's not pushing the whole way to the kind of anti-hypocrisy of complete openness or honesty in any aspect of political life. But what he's arguing against is the hypocrisy of people who draw a veil over not the specific day-to-day details of political life, but its foundations in principle. And what's so interesting for me about Hobbes is that one of the ways he thinks you can be a hypocrite about politics is to put too much weight on personal sincerity. So a Hobbesian example of this kind of hypocrisy is not, he doesn't want a politician to tell you everything that they get up to during the day, some of which he knows will make you feel sick. But he does want politicians who do not pretend that in politics pleas of conviction and sincerity trump other kinds of arguments. Now that for Hobbes is an example of political hypocrisy. And for me the fascinating version of this argument is when he describes the causes and origins of the English Civil War. He believes it was caused by this kind of hypocrisy, that is, people overvaluing their personal convictions and their sincerity. And he says it doesn't matter whether they really were sincere or not. So for Hobbes, you can be, and I think there are, we can talk in a second, there are obvious contemporary examples here.
Yeah.
For Hobbes, you can be genuinely sincere, you can believe God speaks to you, you can believe you are in some sense acting on the basis of convictions that run all the way through your heart. And yet you can still be a political hypocrite, not because of the sincerity of your convictions, but because of the fact that you ought to know that in politics, sincerity is not what counts are results. Now that seems to me an argument that does have a contemporary application. Politicians often try and use as a deal breaker, and in Britain, that the master of this was Tony Blair, the fact that it may have gone wrong, but boy were they sincere in their conviction. They did X or Y in good faith. Now I think it might surprise people who think of Hobbes as just this advocate of power, that he actually would say that that's a kind of political hypocrisy. It's not the case that rulers should be able to get away with anything. They should not be able to get away with talking up the value of their conviction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Well, I mean, and for people who might not understand Hobbes's sort of political theory that well, I mean, he puts a huge amount of weight and responsibility on the sovereign, and it's not a conservative theory about sort of just obeisance to the monarch whom God has anointed as his representative on earth. The structure of Leviathan, one of the reasons why it's a great book is that it's a really complex game theoretical argument for the necessity of somebody with this kind of absolute authority for the stability of civil society. And so the functional role that the sovereign plays is the crux of the whole argument, right? So there's a lot that depends on, for Hobbes, that the sovereign gets to make the decision. They get to decide everything because of the conflict that will arise if these things are sort of open to dispute. But the point of having that sort of unitary point of decision making and adjudication is that it actually has certain results, that it actually does secure the peace of civil society in a way that tends to make everybody better off. So you can't just say, okay, this guy gets to do whatever he wants. That defeats the point, right?
And yeah, absolutely. And the role of religion in this is crucial in that he like you say, he's trying in many ways to get God out of the picture and get people to rest their politics on what they themselves know to be true as rational human beings. But at the same time, he knows that politicians may well need to bring God back into the picture in order to persuade people that they ought to obey the sovereign. And for me, that's what's so interesting about his attitude to hypocrisy, is that it runs through this argument. He doesn't think it's hypocritical for sovereigns to talk about God as the foundation of politics, if that's what's needed to sustain power. And ironically for Hobbes, it would be hypocritical for sovereigns to talk about God sustaining politics and to come to believe it. Because once they come to believe it, then actually they've missed the point about what power rests on, which is not God, it's the will of the sovereign. So it's this strange, I hope this isn't sounding too kind of complex, it's this strange counterintuitive argument, and this is the argument I try and push in the book, that there are ways of being sincere, particularly in questions of religion, in modern politics, which are more hypocritical on this Hobbesian criterion than people who cover up or conceal what they really believe.
I want to talk a little bit more about that, because that's really fascinating to me. Partly because, you're absolutely right that if you that you have to signal to people, especially in American politics, you have to signal a certain level of religious commitment. If you fail to signal that, you are, simply unviable in most sort of regions of and definitely at the national level. So you've got two choices: either you sincerely believe or you lie about. And I think that fact, that's actually a requirement of political office, that you either have sincere, a religious conviction, and it has to be a certain kind of religious conviction as well. I mean, you probably can't be a sincere Muslim, and you probably can't be a sincere Hindu. Like Bobby Jindal has to convert to Catholicism if he's going to be a viable, Republican candidate. But that has the effect that the supply of people who are really competent to be effective public administrators, to be effective policymakers and legislators, is just shattered. Because most of I don't think that I would make a good lawmaker, but I'm an open atheist. Means I can never run for office, right? So suppose I was a good, I would have, had political skills and talent. I would have to, people who have political ambition start thinking early about how to lie about their real religious convictions. And I find that kind of troubling and unsettling and a real problem with, and I don't know how much this is the case in other countries, but I think it's a real problem in American politics.
In some ways, you're looking at it from the British perspective. It's almost the other way around. A lot of people pointed out with Tony Blair that his hypocrisy was the hypocrisy of someone who was a sincere believer and had to cover it up in order to meet the secular standards of British politics. As Alistair Campbell, his press aide, said, we don't do God here, so don't talk about it. So different systems are going to have different criteria for what is and isn't a deal breaker when it comes to the politician's personal beliefs. I mean, the argument that lies behind what I'm saying, I guess, is when you say there is that choice, you either believe or you pretend to believe. And if the political system you inhabit makes that demand of you, if you're going to have a chance of achieving and using power, and for Hobbes that would be the test, then that's bad luck if you want to sincerely talk about your atheism. But for Hobbes, the crucial test would be, it's not about whether you believe or whether you don't believe. It's about whether you remember that actually it doesn't matter whether you believe or you don't believe. What matters is how you use your power. And so, in a way, there's an argument, I think, that comes from Hobbes and runs through a lot of what I want to talk about in my book and the authors that I go on to, which is the political hypocrisy he's worried about is the kind that comes quite close to a sort of self-deception or overvaluing of your personal convictions. And the people he'd be worried about would be the ones who say, well, look, there's this choice. Either you believe or you lie about it. I'm lucky enough to believe, which means somehow I'm in a much better position than they are to rule well. And Hobbes would say, no, you're not. The fact that you believe is irrelevant. You're not better off or worse off than the person who's faking it. The question is what you do with your public persona and your public performance. So, and there is clearly, I think, I'm not an expert on American politics by any means. I'm looking at it from the outside, from this rather more secular state. But I mean, this does seem to be a theme that runs through contemporary American politics, which is the valuing of the person who's able to get up, and everyone knows that a lot of people are going to be faking it. So the one who really doesn't seem to be faking it. And Hobbes would say that's the person you should be worried about, because that person may have forgotten that hypocrisy is a part of political life.
Right, and so. And I think we've experienced a lot of that here with and this is one of the peculiar things about George Bush is his intense sincerity.
Absolutely.
And he makes these appeals, I think, much like you mentioned about Tony Blair. It doesn't matter if the war was a bad idea in Iraq. It doesn't really matter if it was based on a false pretext or that and the thing is, I believe that he's sincere. There's a lot of people who, think that politicians like Bush have, hidden malign motives, that they're really just trying to line the pockets of plutocrats or whatever. But I think this is actually a guy with religious conviction.
Yeah, I agree.
Who is trying to bring liberal democracy to a country, and he thought this is a kind of divine mission. And when you press him on it, that's what his justification is the purity of this intention. To sort of bring freedom to people who are unfree. And maybe it didn't work out, but how could this have been bad if this is what we were after, and that we were pure in our hearts and that desire? And that's exactly what you're saying that Hobbes thinks is completely illegitimate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I came to this, the book I wrote before this was called The Politics of Good Intentions, and it was making exactly that sort of argument, and I wanted to take it further and look at what some great political thinkers of the past might have thought about this. But I absolutely agree. I think that the intentions were sincere. I think that both Blair and Bush, I don't think it was this deep, cynical, malign motivation. But I think in the terms of the Hobbesian argument, even though they're sincere, they're still hypocrites. And the reason they're hypocrites is they overvalue sincerity. And they overvalue sincerity even at the point at which it ought to be clear to them there's something more important than your convictions, which is the consequences of your actions. And at that point, Hobbes would say that's when you can say of someone, and he applied the argument to Presbyterians and preachers in the 1640s, that's the point where you can say to them, I don't care whether you really believe it. This is politics. It's politics, and because it's politics, you thinking that's a trumping argument makes you a hypocrite.
Yeah.
Because you ought to know that. And if you don't know that, you're a fool. And if you're a fool, God help us, because you're ruling.
Yeah. Let's get back to some of the historical parts of the text.
Sure.
You have a fascinating chapter on the American Revolution and the Art of Sincerity, and it starts, no event in modern political history has been so marked by the problem of hypocrisy as the American Revolution. The most elementary reason can be summarized in a single word: slavery. So tell us about the hypocrisy at the problem of hypocrisy in the founding of the United States, and some of the ideas about hypocrisy among some of the American founders, which I found to be fascinating. I'm kind of an American founder history fan, so I found this part really, really hit my sweet spot. So tell me a little bit more about.
Sure. Well, so I start with the slavery question because at the time, both sides, I think, were aware that it was incredibly easy for the other side to accuse them of hypocrisy. The British accused the American freedom fighters of being hypocrites because they were also slave owners, and the Americans accused the British of being hypocrites for calling them hypocrites, given that the British were responsible for the slave trade. And I think both sides were aware. I mean, the point I'm trying to make here is that then, as now, both sides were aware both what a toxic charge hypocrisy can be, but how it has to be very carefully handled, because, of course, the danger is, and you see it, it's as true now as it was then, the danger of screaming hypocrisy too often is that someone will say, well, that just makes you a hypocrite. And so I frame it with that, but then what I want to go on and say is that and I look at Franklin, John Adams, and Jefferson, each of whom in their different ways have a reputation for being an advocate of a kind of sincerity. And what I show is that these people who were incredibly well grounded and well read in classical and early modern thought, running from people like Tacitus through to people like Hobbes, and you couldn't read that stuff and not realize that politics of hypocrisy is much too complicated to be reduced to a simple plea for sincerity. All three of these, in their writing, are grappling with this Hobbesian problem in a way, which is, we don't want to say anything goes in politics because that will open the door to the most dangerous kinds of hypocrisy. But we know our experience of the revolution, among other things, has shown us that you have to be very careful about where you draw the line and how you make the charge of hypocrisy, because it's a difficult one to make stick, because it's always a chance it will come back to you. And so what I try and suggest is that Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson, if you look across their writing, across their lives, were each in their different ways engaged with this. And so I call it the art of sincerity, because each of them come to this sort of paradoxical conclusion that sincerity is an act. But they had different takes on what kind of act works. And of those three, my preference is for John Adams's take, because I think it's actually closest to Hobbes's. And
John Adams is the guy who has the reputation for being a straight shooter.
Yeah.
Right. Like, he's the guy who has the reputation for, just always putting his cards on the table, and sometimes sometimes he should be a little bit more prudent in his self-presentation, but he was sort of like famous for, like, I've got to say what I think even if it's offensive to you. Franklin is, in terms of sincerity, I think of him as the ultimate American, or the primal American fake it till you make it guy. All his advice, he's like one of the first, best-selling self-help authors.
Sure, yeah.
And a lot of that is just like pretend like you're successful and help people assume that you're successful, and then you'll be successful. And he was he was completely happy to dissimulate, right? Like, so when he was in, as you mentioned, in the court in France, he put on this show about the sort of podunk American walking around in his beaver skin cap, and he was just happy to play out this idea about a sort of like the paradoxical mix of American primitivism and scientific sophistication, right? He was a role player, and he was happy to do it, and he was fantastic at it. But that bugged Adams.
It did.
So tell us about the difference between their views.
Sure. I take a similar line on Franklin, that it absolutely is. It's an act, and it's an act that he explicitly justifies in, broadly, it's not quite the right word, but broadly utilitarian terms, that the reason it makes sense to be sincere and to tell the truth is that it pays. Whereas Adams, like you say, mean, the interesting thing about Adams is not merely he's a sort of put your cards on the table kind of guy, but that he himself regretted he was that kind of guy. He wrote in his diary, and some of his friends said of him, if only he could dissimulate a bit more, and he knew it himself. One of the things that infuriated him about Franklin was Adams' sense that a little bit more of the Franklin stuff in him would have taken him even further than he got, although he got pretty far. But the difference, I think, between them and my as it were, coming down on the Adams side, is that Adams was very conscious, and again, you could almost call it a Hobbesian way, of the danger of the person who starts off seeing that sincerity is an act and it pays, coming to believe their own publicity. And I think he thought, in Franklin's case, there was a very serious danger of that the success of the act means that the person behind the mask just forgets what's a mask and what isn't.
Right.
And they also come to give out this advice that in the end, particularly in politics, can be extremely unhelpful advice because it overvalues sincerity. Whereas Adams tried to do that thing which was, even though, again, it's the irony of this, that he was more personally sincere in many ways and that he was more open. But when it came to politics, he believed you had to tell it like it is about politics. And telling it like it is about politics was letting people know that politics was about appearance, rank, hierarchy, performance. And he told the truth about politics in a way that Franklin didn't. And that's, in a sense, why I think Franklin was, in many ways, a more successful politician, and Jefferson was as well. But I think Adams is the deeper political thinker.
Well, and Jefferson just beat him into the ground, partly because because Adams told the truth in this way, and Jefferson was just, an incredibly conniving, dissimulating sort of guy.
Creep, yeah.
Yeah. I've always felt. I'm glad that you mentioned in your this section Gore Vidal's book Burr, which has my favorite contemptuous characterization of Thomas Jefferson in it.
It's fantastic. I love it. But you can't deny, and I say it in the book, you can't deny, for all the contempt, Burr is written by, it's written on the part of the losers. It's the loser's tale in history. Jefferson was, of those three, the political genius, probably, if you think of politics as this kind of, for want of a better word, this Machiavellian scheme. But again, just as with Franklin, with Jefferson, the thing that chilled Adams, and I think you can feel some of the chill even now, was the thought that Jefferson believed some of this stuff. I mean, he believed some of this stuff about sincerity and truth, even as he was himself betraying these beliefs. And it's that possibility that with Adams, you never get that feeling with Adams, that he ever loses sight of the underlying morally compromised nature of the business that he's engaged in. Whereas with Jefferson, like I say, the book is trying to say there's an alternative between cynicism and sanctimony. Well, with Jefferson, you kind of get cynicism and you get sanctimony. But it's not clear that he leaves much room for the thing in between. But Adams gives you the thing in between, which is a kind of cold-eyed view of politics that sees all the charade for what it is and yet still tries to find a place in it for truth-telling.
I've always found, I agree with your assessment of these guys as well. I always saw Adams as actually the best, sort of most careful and useful sort of political theorist among the theorist of politics and government among the American founders. Thomas Jefferson he has this kind of brilliant clarity and this incredible rhetorical gift. And I think an incredibly penetrating intelligence. But he doesn't talk about it. It lacks a certain kind of complexity. You feel like he's hiding something. And then when you learn about the guy himself, you find like he is in fact hiding all sorts of things. And that's what. And so I think nowadays people don't like Jefferson largely because of, the obvious kind of hypocrisy, involved in.
Involving slavery and so on.
Yeah, the slavery is, just completely repulsive and it's a moral crime, and yet the guy ends up getting himself in massive debt, which makes it so that he can't ever really free his slaves, and and then there's the sort of his, setting aside even the sort of relations, intimate relations with your slaves. It takes away some of the luster of his founding father kind of mythos.
Yeah. I mean, and I was conscious even as I was writing the book that John Adams' star was rising, and that I heard this HBO series was being made about him and so on. But the sort of Adams revival seems to be founded, like you say, just as Jefferson's star is falling because of people's personal revulsion. People like things about Adams' life, and they like things about his character, but they haven't gone back to his political thought. And in some ways, it's interesting in that I think if people did read the political thought, they would find it surprisingly blunt and in some ways shocking. Bits of it read deeply cynical, but I don't think they are, because the thing, and I emphasize this a lot in the book, Adams, I feel, is always warning against what he sees as the temptations of democratic sincerity, to actually draw a veil over the inevitable compromises and corruptions of democratic life. And if you draw a veil over them, actually democracy will end up much worse, because what you'll get is sanctimony on the surface and something really, really dark underneath. And that therefore you've constantly got to pull that veil back and let people see, a bit like going back to your earlier question, but not tell people what you get up to all day. But in his writing, he just makes this great point in his writing about how politics works, the importance of recognizing what motivates people, people's desire for preference, for attention. He emphasizes the basic impulse of human beings is to be noticed in what they do. And he thinks that if you make sure that people don't forget this, actually you'll get a more sincere politics. I mean, there's always these ironies running through these writers, whereas he thinks the Jeffersonian version, I don't think he's right about this, the Jeffersonian version will give you a mixture of a really glittering surface and something very, very messy underneath.
Yeah. Well, and here's something that I find disconcerting, where when I read, there's something in Adams's writings and also in James Madison's writings, and that are clearly related to writers like Adam Smith, where there's a very deep recognition that people are motivated by self-interest, and that they're motivated by ambition and status. And so at one level it seems like that's a cynical account of human motivation. But at the same time there's this very strong stress on the importance of the cultivation of virtue in order to sort of restrain and channel the impulses of self-interest and sort of ambition and emulation. And that kind of, I mean, it just seems, that always just strikes me as just obviously correct. That when you're looking at sort of behavior generally, you're trying to predict mass, patterns of behavior. You do best if you assume, not always virtuous or benevolent motives. That if you assume that people are going to act in their interest and that they're going to be moved by ambition and relative status, you're going to do a good job of understanding and predicting what's going to happen, which you need to do if you're going to be able to author a good constitution, if you're going to be able to author effective public policy. But noting that doesn't mean conceding that these things can't be channeled by the culture in ways that are better or worse, and that virtue isn't worth cultivating. And that's what I think is so interesting about Adams, because he's a man who's so adamant about the importance of a life according to virtue, while he is very, very clear-minded about our kind of Mandevillian motivation.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think what's attractive about Adams particularly is that he doesn't just think it's crucial that you shouldn't assume that other people are acting for virtuous motives, but you shouldn't assume it about yourself either. That it does require, self-knowledge is a big part of this. And of course, self-knowledge is one of the things that is hardest to keep hold of in politics. I say this, I'm not a politician, how do I know? But I'm guessing that self-knowledge is something that can be the first thing to go. And I think as Adams looked both back at Franklin and looked ahead at Jefferson, he thought that this, in a sense, was going, and it wasn't just going from them, but as it were, America was losing a certain kind of self-knowledge by overvaluing, talking up virtue and ignoring the role of self-interest. But absolutely, I agree with you that that's what's so attractive about those writers, and I think a range of writers, is that it's neither that deep cynicism and nor is it that elevated or overstated account of human virtue, and that's particularly why it's so attractive as a theory of politics.
Yeah. Well, let's skip ahead a little bit and talk a bit about George Orwell, and then finally talk about contemporary politics.
Sure.
Orwell is usually thought of as this sort of a paragon of clarity. And that politics and the art of writing is this, the great anti-BS in politics essay, which would seem to make Orwell the arch enemy of political hypocrisy. Yet you say he is able to adjust himself to the idea of a certain kind of hypocrisy in politics. So tell us about that.
Absolutely. Sure. I mean, Orwell is used, and you've heard, I notice it. You see it in the current campaign in the States. You see it it runs all the way through politics and political journalism, is that one of the people that you wheel out if you want to accuse your opponents of hypocrisy is Orwell. It's almost assumed that if Orwell's against them, they must be a hypocrite, and if they're a hypocrite, Orwell must have been against them. And yet, if you read what Orwell has to say, he's very, very clear that, like all the writers I look at, that a certain amount of hypocrisy is absolutely unavoidable in political life, particularly in democracy. And he talks a lot. In the essay he wrote in 1940 and 41, the essays were collected as The Lion and the Unicorn, one of which is called Your England, and it's about the hypocrisy of English democratic life. And one can summarize that essay by saying it's terrible, we're all hypocrites, but thank God we are, because there's something worse, which is a political society which has dropped hypocrisy altogether, in which people can be completely, as it were, unhindered by the need to dissemble or to conceal, and one word for such a society is fascism. So I think Orwell had a very clear sense that there were worse things than hypocrisy, and that there is a kind of political sincerity which is worse because it has nothing to hide. And I argue that 1984 is actually, among other things, a picture of a world without hypocrisy, where no one can hide anything. But the other thing that Orwell, I think, is very clear about is that within hypocrisy, you need to be careful that you don't assume it's all equally bad. And for Orwell, the classic distinction would be democratic hypocrisy, that is, politicians pretending to be better than they really are, overstating some aspect of their own self, maybe overstating the value of their own beliefs, but as long as they know that's what they're doing, that's fine. Imperial hypocrisy, the hypocrisy of an imperial power that's pretending to rule people in their own interests, when in fact the underlying basis of the politics is pure coercion, that's unacceptable. And so I think actually Orwell ends up arguing that what English or British, but he would call it English political life needs to do is, as it were, rescue itself from its imperial hypocrisy in order to save its democratic hypocrisy. Again, it's a kind of complicated argument, but what's so interesting about it is it's a complicated argument coming from the person who's assumed to be the anti-hypocrite who just will beat you with a stick if he smells hypocrisy in you. Well, right. That's not the Orwell that appears from the pages of his own writing. That is the Orwell that appears from the pages of 21st century Orwellians, the people who are championing him. And you see this argument, and I talk about it in the book, it played out in relation to the Iraq War. Christopher Hitchens, for example, is a classic example of a writer who uses Orwell as a stick to hit people with whom he doesn't agree with. But I think Orwell would find that kind of anti-hypocrisy repugnant.
Fascinating. I mean, it makes you wonder. I mean, I love the idea that 1984 is a book about a world without hypocrisy because nobody can hide anything. And and that does make you. It makes me wonder about if we're thinking of hypocrisy as putting up a mask. It's not always revealing your true motives or your true feelings about things. It's very hard to see how a polite society is even possible without some level of dissimulation, some level of dissembling. And this becomes especially true when you live in an extremely diverse, pluralistic, liberal society where people's values could be very starkly in opposition. And in order for people to be able to talk to each other in the public sphere, they have to find a space in which they can sort of pretend that they have common ground. And the pretense of common ground is probably better, it seems, than than bringing up constantly that, well, you know what, you evangelical Christian, I know that you in fact think that I am going to burn in hell for eternity.
Yeah.
Right? If they brought that up, if they said, I got to say, now that we're sitting down together, that you're a sinner who's going to burn in hell for eternity, right? Like, that's not going to be very helpful for being able to live political life together. So a certain level of just sort of masking what you really think about other people's views. And also, I don't want to say, I think you're just a moron, for, thinking that, people rise from the dead, blah, 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 right? Like, that's not going to get us anywhere. So, so it seems like a certain amount of keeping secrets from other people about what you really think, and is a kind of necessary condition for civil life. And then also there's simply the old, hypocrisy is the, compliment that vice pays to virtue, that sometimes virtues are hard, but you still want people to praise virtues. So even if sometimes people fail to live up to those virtues, you don't want to say that they can't praise them because they don't exemplify them.
And what you've been describing there is a recognizable 18th century view of human life and of polite society and how civilized functioning is possible. But like you say, I think, in some ways we see that 18th century worldview and it can look very cynical to us. It can look dated in many ways. But as you say, I think in many ways the fact that this is a pluralist democratic society makes it more important, not less important. As we become more democratic, we mustn't lose touch with that pre-democratic 18th century polite view of what it is to be virtuous, which is to pretend to be virtuous, because that's the glue that holds it together. And there is a danger that as we've become more democratic, more open, as our politics has been subjected to more scrutiny, as there's more information out there, it's become much harder to sustain that. It's much easier to look behind the mask than it would have been in 1750. You can always, if you look hard enough these days, for anyone in public life, you can find something that gives the lie to the public persona that they want to present. And so it's incredibly tempting. It's particularly incredibly tempting in politics. It's particularly tempting in the blogosphere to do it, because at the click of a button you can usually find something that will show your enemy to be a fraud and a hypocrite. And therefore I think it's important to remember that underlying view about politeness and what holds a society together, particularly at a moment where it's very, very easy to see behind the mask. That's again one of the themes I try and raise in the book, that the easier it is to see behind the mask, the more careful you have to be about assuming it's always a good thing to rip the mask off. It can become just a lazy habit. I think it has become a lazy habit in some of the ways that we comment on politics. And it's not to say that sometimes you don't need to look behind the mask. You have to have that option. But if it's the default position of your politics, what you get in the end is, I think, what we have now, which is a kind of corrosive cynicism and often a kind of they're all as bad as each other view. Whereas letting the politicians keep the mask in place actually would make us possibly trust them more. I hope
let's talk about some of our politicians. At the beginning of the book, you asked the tantalizing question about, what would Thomas Hobbes think about Hillary Clinton?
Yeah.
At the time that your book came out, it was clear that it was coming down between Hillary and Obama. You hadn't predicted McCain yet, so you say that Hillary and Barack Obama are each two different kinds of hypocrites, and one is preferable to the other. So what kinds of hypocrites are Clinton and Obama?
Yeah, so on the what would Hobbes think of Hillary question, I think he would have thought she was fine, in that she's relatively self-aware. It's so hard to judge these things, but she's relatively self-aware, understood as recognizing the kinds of compromises that are required of her in politics. And I think from her and from her persona, you get in many ways a clearer account of what politics is and what's possible within it. And that Obama, I wrote this last year, but I haven't really changed my mind about this. With Obama, if you see that one of the tests of the dangerous kind of hypocrisy is how close it comes to self-deception, or how close it comes to really drawing a veil over what makes politics politics. I am a little suspicious of the politicians who try and transcend politics through their ability to seem to be speaking from the heart. I think there's a double danger. The danger that they overvalue their own sincerity, and therefore they overvalue themselves. And the other danger, which is that they lose sight of some of the unavoidable John Adams-style compromises and confusions of virtue that come with politics. So, from the Hobbesian point of view, I think the thing about Hillary Clinton that might be attractive is that the personal hypocrisy, and I think she probably is personally more hypocritical, you can probably trawl up more evidence that she is wearing a mask than Obama, may go with a kind of political sincerity, meaning sincerity about what politics is. And that with Obama it may be the reverse. I don't doubt in many ways that Obama is the person he comes across as. What I worry is that he may lose sight of the fact that the person he comes across as is slightly out of touch with political reality. So I think there is a way of reading that it's a classic sort of binary choice in politics between those two types. But what I really want to emphasize, and I'm trying to emphasize in the book, is our current preoccupation with personal hypocrisy. Is the person who they say they are as good as they pretend to be, consistent to their own principles? That's not always the right question. You could alternatively ask, are they truthful and consistent about what makes our politics tick? And for that reason, I've always thought that Hillary Clinton would be both a better candidate and a better president. But what do I know?
Well, the thing that's always, and I think I agree with one fundamental aspect of what you're saying about Obama, which we're thinking of it as there being sort of, there's the mask and then there's the face behind the mask. Yeah. I have the same worry that in Obama, his face is fused with the mask. And the reason that seems like such a worry is that he's written these incredibly sort of closely observed memoirs where you see him very self-consciously constructing an identity for the purpose of its political viability, right? That his persona is something that's constructed with its appearance at the political level in mind. So when he decides to identify with his blackness as opposed to identify with his mother's whiteness or to identify as being explicitly biracial, for example, it's hard to avoid that he sees that there's a bigger upside politically in being a black guy instead of having this sort of complicated identity that doesn't fit well within these sort of the simplified narratives of. But then he really does invest himself in it. It really does become a part of his person. And the thing I can't figure out about him is the extent to which these decisions about his identity were the result of a sincere yearning for a kind of sense of self and a sense of rootedness, connection to his father or whatever, or to what extent it's strategic. And I don't know. And that actually kind of bothers me about him, is that I somehow don't really doubt his sincerity, but I doubt the sincerity of the person that he is sincerely projecting. I completely agree with that analysis. It fits very well with some of the things I'm trying to say. The other thing about it that has struck me all the way along, I know he launched himself, among other things, as a Abraham Lincoln for the 21st century, but he's also often touched base with Thomas Jefferson. The idea of Thomas, and this is Jeffersonian in the ways that we talked about earlier, in that, there's a person there behind the mask who's thought a lot about the mask and what mask needs to be worn, and then you start to worry about whether they have completely invested in that mask and have forgotten the ways in which it's a construct, and that makes you worry that there's a kind of sanctimony overlaying this which has slightly turned their minds. Or whether they are, despite having fully invested in this, they're still very, very conscious that it's just a mask, which in some ways seems more deeply cynical than the kind of chopping and changing and flip-flopping that you might associate with a routine candidate, because of the level of investment in the persona. And I think, again, that
like with Jefferson, like I said with Jefferson, you can see a reading of it which makes it deeply cynical. You can see a reading of it which makes it so sincere that it's sanctimonious. And I find it hard to construct the person who might be somewhere in between. Whereas with Hillary Clinton, I find it actually much easier to find the person who's neither purely cynical nor purely sanctimonious. And
she seems
so
transparently cynical and power-seeking, and
she
barely hides it.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think there's something she wants to do with power, something worthwhile that she maybe wants to do with power, and I think there is a deep understanding and recognition of what is and isn't possible in politics. And these things in some ways may be more attractive to me, I was going to say to some voters, to me, than the Obama version of it. I mean, who knows? In the case of, the other way I'd put the Obama thing is that kind of persona, it can be absolutely the sort of apogee of what you want in a politician, but it's very rare. I mean, it does come along very rarely. I mean, he could be Abraham Lincoln. But on the other hand, he could be Thomas Jefferson or even less than Jefferson. And the odds are he's not Abraham Lincoln. And if he's not, there is something to be worried about here in a politician who, as you say, spends so much time and trouble constructing the mask to the point that you're therefore not sure whether either you or they know where the mask ends and the person begins.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Well, I think we just hit our... the hour mark.
Did we? It did go quick, like you said.
Yeah, it goes quicker than you think. So I think you've given people a lot to think about. Sorry, I made you talk about American politics because there's a lot to say about.
No, that's fine. It's what's.
Gordon Brown and David Cameron as well.
We managed to do the whole thing without talking about Sarah Palin, and that's a triumph, I think.
that is a triumph of non-dumbification.
Of the human spirit. Yeah.
But so thanks so much, David, for coming on. The book is Political Hypocrisy, The Mask of Power from Hobbes to Orwell and Beyond. And it really does, I think, illuminate a lot of what's going on in the contemporary political scene. So I hope people check it out. And I think you just convinced me that Obama is, in fact, a Jeffersonian.
In every way. Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's been very interesting.
Thanks.
Okay.
Take care.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.